Hello, everyone. Welcome to the 9th webinar in our Marg Salon program. I'm Mrinalini Vasudevan, Senior Assistant Editor at Marg, joining from Calcutta. And we are very pleased to have with us for today's session on the economy of nurturance and cultural well-being, Kaushik Basu, who's joining us from Cornell, and Ela Bhatt, who's joining us from Ahmedabad. This evening's conversation is part of an ongoing salon series where we focus on the broader theme of futures of the planet and art worlds to come. This is running parallel to our Futures of Art Studies series. But it's slightly different in the sense that we look at art within the larger context of socio-cultural politics, and we focus on specific terms as well as fields, established as well as emerging, which are now part of popular parlance, but at the same time, there seems to be a tendency to misinterpret them or to think of them rather simplistically. So in the last session, we looked at multiculturalism, and we had poet Shitanshu Yashashchandra and political philosopher Bhiku Parekh provide their interpretations of the term, talk about the challenges of applying the term to the ways in which we express ourselves and govern others, as well as the relevance of the term today. Today, we are looking at two more concepts, nurturance and well-being. And of course, we are looking at these cultural ideals from the aspects of law, economics, policy, and governance. And one thing is, and that's very important to state right at the beginning, is that there's a tendency to think of the arts and culture sector as divorced from the economic sector, and that must change because after all, market dynamics as well as financial support are crucial to the ways in which aesthetic traditions and practices have shaped up and are able to survive over time. On the other hand, it's also very important to reinterpret economic aims and goals, as well as national progress reports in terms of cultural well-being and happiness. We've seen that in some countries like Bhutan as well as Sweden, where they've tried to look at this intersection and transform the way in which they project their national image as well as deal with policy internally. But India lags behind on that front. Of course, there are lots of administrators, scholars, and activists who've been working to change that view, and we are very pleased to have with us two of them. And Ela Ben and Kaushik, of course, don't really need much of an introduction, but I'm just going to briefly give their background so that we know the kind of perspectives from which they are coming into this conversation. Ela Bhatt is a Gandhian lawyer and activist, and she started her career with the Textile Labor Association in Ahmedabad, and then she went on to found SEWA, Self-Employed Women's Association of India, in 1972. The main goal of SEWA is to provide independent financial backing as well as protection of rights and livelihoods for women in India's unorganized labor sector. She's received several national as well as international awards for this work, which include the Magsaysay and the Padma Bhushan. And she's currently a Vice Chancellor of Gujarat Vidyapeeth, and she's part of an international association called the Elders, who look into matters of leadership and social justice across various countries. Kaushik Basu is an economist. His areas of interest are developmental economics, political economy, industrial labor and organization, and game theory, and he's written extensively on these subjects. He has been a part of the World Bank as well as an advisor to the UPA government between 2009 and 2012. He's also lectured in several prestigious universities and is currently Professor of Economics and International Studies at the Cornell University. In that context, it's also important to state that today's event is in partnership with the Cornell South Asia program, and we are very happy to have their support. What will happen now is a 45-minute discussion session where Kaushik and Ela Ben will take questions posed by Rizio Johanan, writer and publisher at the Marg Foundation. And then we'll have our standard 20 to 25-minute question and answer round, where I'll be taking questions posed by the audience. and try and keep the questions as brief and direct as possible, and of course, try and state who it's addressed to. We'll also have 2 poll questions running at the end of the session, so do share your honest feedback about your experience of this webinar over there. In case we are unable to take certain important questions because of limited time, do repost them with recordings of the session that will be available on YouTube and Facebook, and we'll try and look into those over there. Rizio, I pass the session on to you to take it forward.
Thank you, Mrinalini. Indeed, very happy that we have with us Ela Bhatt and Kaushik Basu, 2 people whose lives and work have been so inspiring to some of us. Thank you, Ela and Kaushik Da, for being with us today. It's a privilege to be hosting this conversation. Mrinalini has already mentioned why we began this series of conversations called Futures of the Planet and Art Worlds to Come. 2020 is Mark's 75th year, and all that have happened and happening through this year have starkly brought home to us one recognition, that we can no longer talk to ourselves and be complacent, that we must speak actively with the world around us in order to remain relevant. But this world has shown itself to be a paradoxical one. On the one hand, with all the communication technologies, it has become more connected than ever. And on the other, more fragmented than ever due to the conflicts engendered by the way we use language to discuss class, caste, race, gender, all this. So it's not easy for a publishing space, a word space like Marg, to engage relevantly with the agonies and ecstasies of this world. But if we must, we got to accept that it is not going to be a linear conversation, that we must go to insightful minds from fields beyond the arts too, like our speakers today, and we must go with humility. And so we are very thankful that our speakers have seen our need to go to them with these questions that are on our minds. The seed of today's conversation, the term nurturance, came from Ela Bhatt. And we had this exchange at a time when Marg was grappling with an idea that has now become the core of the December 2020 issue of Marg magazine, which is now at the design stage. The notion of cultural well-being, this is what we were dealing with. In September, the new avatar of the Marg magazine, which is this, asked if 2020 could be understood as a species of change and not as a dead end. That led us to the what and why and how of this change at this time. And we chose to take up in our forthcoming issue, which is December. That is how we arrived at this key phrase, cultural well-being, which allows us to think through the changes that we are experiencing today. All of us in India know that under Article 19 of our Constitution, we have been granted many kinds of freedom, especially freedom of speech and expression. And under Article 51A, we also have the duty to develop scientific temper, humanism, and the spirit of inquiry and reform. At Marg, we thought if these words in our Constitution find their true manifestations in our time, perhaps things could change and our citizens will enjoy what could be called cultural well-being. But the question is, do these words ever find their true manifestations? And if they don't, why? That is where the term nurturance became important for us while thinking about cultural well-being. And it was imperative that we not only discuss this idea in social and cultural terms, but in economic terms also, because it is our attitude towards economy that might decide the extent to which nurturance of our constitutional ideals could be promoted. And to discuss that, we could not think of anyone better than Kaushik Da. What has become crucial for us in this context is his emphasis on integrity as an essential quality to be cultivated both at individual and societal levels. That is, if we want development in the real sense. So it also reminds us of the architect Buckminster Fuller, who said integrity is the essence of architecture and design. In an invisible world, the only aesthetic is integrity, he said. If we don't have integrity, the design falls apart in a way nothing of value could be nurtured. And this should explain the choice of speakers today and the interconnections within our title, Economy of Nurturance and Cultural Well-being. With that, let us turn to Ela Bhatt and Kaushik Da. I'll start with a common question for both of them to begin with. This is to both of you, Ela Bhatt and Kaushik Da. We just talked about the paradoxical nature of our world. One of the aspects of this paradox is the felt gap between critical thinking that is available in the world. There is no dearth of thinking, real deep thinking, and the functioning of particular governments or institutions. We know that it is not because of lack of thinking that governments or institutions function in a particular way. And then on the other side, there is also a gap between a creative individual who uses her intuition or moral courage to do things at the micro level and her own level, and the superficiality or unsustainability of public debate on what needs to be done at the macro level. So while communication should ideally bridge these kind of gaps, with our latest communication devices and platforms, we seem to be heading towards more and more polarization and consequent violence. Could you both share some initial thoughts on how you would like to begin a deliberation on nurturance and well-being, these key phrases that we are talking about today, in this context? Because it even defies common logic that with all our communication devices, we are becoming more and more polarized. So where, in your view, must we begin? Let me start with Ela Bhatt. Ela Bhatt, over to you.
You talked of paradox. There are so many paradoxes, not one, what you mentioned. So, and paradoxes that are shameful, painful. I should speak loudly. Yes. So, how can otherwise we can explain the recent longest march, largest march that we had of the workers, empty stomach, empty pocket, having dues not paid, and walking, reaching to their home to meet their mother and wife and children. And you see that there has been agitation. There must be a lot of agitation inside, but they did not, destroy any property. They didn't throw stones or like that. They didn't protest. They did protest, but very humbly. So, according to me, and such hard working, our labor or part of the workforce, and there was nothing. It was so painful, not provided for any support or help. Look at the cities. called, citadels of culture and engines of growth and, melting pots. Our cities, melting pots of social hierarchy and those big words. The urban authorities, municipal corporations of big cities looked away, they turned their face away. They saw all this. I mean, dollar, trillion dollar economy, voila. Oh, they were hurting their own workforce. I really can't understand. How we all collectively consented. It was bloodless violence to our own working majority. Government did, something, but that was too little. And also the other paradox. We have left economy to economist, culture to culturist. That is a paradox. Good, but however, economy must be owned, must be shaped on the basis of daily economic activities. And like various acts of producing and trading and all that, investing and banking and all that, those activities and actors should be part of shaping the economy. What we call the economic democracy is yet to be realized. So the decisions are taken by policymakers, teachers, scholars, and not by economic workers, not who do the economy actively. So I think that is another paradox. So I would say that let the economy be shaped bottom up. Actually, those who are acting. You may get me wrong. I do understand that, but I'm not against paradox. Paradox also are potent. They have potency. According to my Seva experience, the illiterate, poor women, they did form their own cooperative bank, and that is in the mainstream. Similarly, union, those who had no employers and working on their own, they had the trade union, which is the mainstream. Rudy, which is our marketing network, rural marketing network, and there it has been able to link a producer and consumers directly, and that covers almost the whole district of the lower level, and their purchase power has gone up, so they are able to educate their children, etc. So there are potentials. We have strategy of joint action of union and cooperative. So that is there I see a democratic economy in at work. So it is possible also, and there are good points also in the paradox that you mentioned. But so I meant to say that I am not against, but I am for reducing poverty effect on workers and their work, and rather we should be enhancing its potency. I trust them, and they do have the necessary potency. I believe so.
Kaushika, how do you mention? Ela talked about the potency of this paradoxical situation. It's painful, but there is a certain potency which can be actually we can use it. We can transform it. How do you look at it?
Rizio, thank you very much. Before I get into this, let me just mention once that I'm very grateful for the opportunity to participate. For the audience, I should mention it's been very nice interacting with Rizio and the team. But the reason I first said yes when Rizio asked me, whom I had not known till she asked me, was because of Ela Bhatt. I really said just yes because I wanted to be in a forum with her. I have, with huge gaps because I live in a different place, I have interacted with her. Her empathy, activism, secularism, instinctive secularism, these appeal to me just hugely, I have to say. And that's the reason why I wanted to participate. I should also tell you, one of my first interactions in preparation for today's talk, I was remembering, we had gone with Seva. This is where I saw what Nurturance can do on the ground. We met in Ahmedabad. It was in Makar Sankranti. The skies had kites, a beautiful morning, 2004. And then a group of us went to Jakotra in Patan district to see the activity of Seva. And for me, it was mind-boggling seeing this face-to-face, what you can do through the right kinds of concerns and activism. The names are just rushing to my head. Dohi Ben, Gauri Ben, Mamtaz Baluch, Saira Baluch. These were, in fact, my first meeting was very memorable, Ela Bhatt. After we went from Ahmedabad, the team of us, into Jakotra, the first evening, this is the only time I've been in a meeting where there were 36 women and me alone. I've never been in such a gender imbalanced meeting as that one in the village of Jakotra. It's a wonderful experience to see these people feeling empowered with a voice. And this is what Nurturance can do. So thank you very much. With that, let me jump straight away into the kinds of issues that you're bringing in, and Ela Bhatt just touched on. Yes, it is true that the mechanistic view of growth that we take, and yes, economists, I suppose, are partly responsible, economic growth, many other dimensions of life fall away, drop away from our attention. I have to say, Amartya Sen, who has repeatedly written about empowerment and capabilities, also in his work stresses the broader vision of growth. And what happens with that, some of this is mechanically also, if you look at growth, if you look at inequality, in 2017, Oxfam produced a report where we saw that in that year, 2017, 73% of the wealth created in India went to 1% of the population. So the rest was for 99% of the people to share, 23% gets to 1% of the population. We also know from the same study that in India, with a lot of poverty, people are falling below the poverty line and going above. But in any single year, 63 million people go below the poverty line by virtue of one medical incident. You have some health problem. You try to cope with that, you have to spend a little bit of money, and that puts you below the poverty line. 63 million people get plunged into the poverty line. This is not where we should be for a country which has had now several years, 15, 20 years of growth. The growth has to be defined differently. And the communications device that you're talking about, Rizio, there is something about that which is creating a polarized world, which is also affecting our sense of awareness. Since Ela Bhatt mentioned, we jointly wrote a piece about the migrants and the suffering that took place. That is indeed a very good illustration of what happened on 24th of March onwards with the migrants. Is with the lockdown that we went for, and some kind of a lockdown was called for, it just shows that we gave a 4-hour notice without, in retrospect, it became clear, without even aware of there was this mass of population that would be pushed out. In fact, by some dimensions, India had the weakest of lockdowns because you had 23 million people scattered all over, trying to get back to home, as Ela Bhatt reminds me. Many of them left their home also reluctantly for the little bit of food and money that they need, that they had to travel great distances. Then we shut them off and scatter them through the country, making both a travesty of the meaning of lockdown when you have 23 million people scattered over the country, and also the fact that they were not even in our consciousness, these people who got pushed out, just shows that unless we take a broader vision of the economy, where economy is rooted in nurturance, as Ela Bhatt has stressed so many times, we will get things wrong. And maybe we can build a powerful, wealthy economy, but to me, that is not the aim of a society, to build just economic power. There is much more that we are ignoring, and that is beginning to bite us. The hate and division that is building up is a surprise of some of the things that we have ignored.
Thank you, Kaushik, and thank you for that Seva memories, because I also have my personal memories about going to different centers of Seva. I recall with real fondness one of the things which we really connect with what you just said. I was at one center where we had a lot of women, as you know, like it's all full of women, and I asked one of them, Kakubai, so I said, what is Kakuban? What is the difference between your current? They are very powerful women. You know, they are like they are in control of their lives and words, and very powerful. They've gone to America like 3 times and all that. You know, representing Seva. So yeah, I asked them like, what is the difference between 20 years back when you were not part of Seva and now? And she looked at me and she said, the main difference is when I was walking 20 years back, these streets of this same village, people would say, this person's aurat is walking. And today they say, Kakuben is coming. So that is the difference, you know. So this is what actually this idea of nurturance has done. And I saw this in Kakuben's words are just indicative of how these 12 lakhs of women across this country have really transformed their lives and vision and attitude towards things, you know. So I would like to come to Ela Bhatt with that question. Ela Bhatt, you've always talked about women as the key to building a community. You've also exemplified your work, as I just mentioned, your own work, the significance of focusing on the micro, because Kaushik was just mentioning about like why just building that economic power is not enough. So you've always focused on the micro as a way to enhance our daily lives and also to protect our societies. As I said, I've interacted with the Sisters of Seva, and this is one sense that you get. There are 2 focal points to your space. One is women. The other is the micro level. And they are brought together to nurture dynamic locales that define their own socio-cultural well-being. So how do you see this happening in today's world? Because I see 2 things. One, the world is getting homogenized very fast. And that local flavor is going off from many spaces. 2, women's role and location within the family and its economic structure have changed. So do we need a new community building strategy? What do you think about this, Ela Bhatt?
You see, regarding micro and macro, it is possible to have micro without macro. But it's not possible to have macro without micro. So let us not divide micro and macro. It's a process. Let me explain. We are told, Kaushik Bhai, pardon me if I talk about economics, but you see, we are told that a rapid rise in GDP will lead to rapid fall in poverty. We are told that macro changes will have a micro impact. By policymakers, they say that micro changes will lead to shape the macro change. I say we need to focus on primary needs. Leave all other things or baat chodo. But talk about our primary needs, everybody's, rich or poor. And which is, everybody knows, roti, kapda, makan, food and clothing and shelter. So there are, these three sectors at the local level, when they are targeted to reach in terms of income, employment, skills, technology, and R&D centers. Why not? That will be more truthful. So then this happens, then we see that we do move towards some nurturance, building it. So even art, craft, design, so they are also included, no, already. As you grow in terms of your primary needs, the culture also grows. That is what I have seen. So I should not talk like this, but I strongly feel that cut down the distance between producer and consumer. Cut down the distance between producer and raw material. Cut down the distance between the governor and the governed. I see that at least in case of primary needs, roti kapda makan, primary healthcare, primary banking. So let there be less and less distance of maybe direct contact as far as possible. So then, and I see that there are abundant opportunities of growth, poverty elevation, employment generations, skill development, skill diversifying. So I see a lot of possibilities. It is possible. In pandemic, actually in pandemic, we see that the link of farmers with the urban consumer in Ahmedabad, that has been direct link that has happened. We cannot have such economic growth at the cost of ecology. सचमुच में तो economies should revive, regenerate. They should be reviving and regenerating ecologies. That is the challenge. At micro level, it is possible. And that is, I see, as a way to nurturing economy. Also, how to avoid. What should be avoided? And that is these separations. all kinds of separations. Separation of economy and society, separation of growth and equity, between investment and social development, or social investment and financial investment, and between formality and informality in the employment sector. In culture also cannot be separated from well-being. Economic growth cannot be at the cost of well-being of anyone, at the cost of the basic primary culture. Otherwise, I would rather call it, or I have been calling it, destructive way, even self-destructive way. Regarding feminine way, not women, but feminine. So I don't mean to exclude men. No, don't misunderstand me, or don't misunderstand. I mean to say that women have all the answers. It is a feminine way of thinking, doing things, acting, protecting, caring, nurturing. We would not have been here today if we were not nurtured by our mothers. So, our parents. So, please do not misunderstand. We honor the feminine within men, all men, every man. Okay. To women. In women, I find, let me tell you, I have listed out what I find while working in Seva Sisters all these years. In women, I find that she is locally linked with nature. Woman is very much local, and she is linked with nature. Then a female task is to hold, preserve. She cares for the roots because of the children, maybe. She cares for stability. Her task is to be catalyst, to grow laterally. That is what I have seen in Seva. They like to grow laterally, not vertically. And they understand that that is the power. Lateral is the power. Then they also like to work in groups. Even it is one woman's job, but she will always take another two along with her. So, and from groups, they naturally ready to grow to cooperatives, associations, and also this is how the community is built up. Feminine is less focused on goals to be achieved, rather more on values, ways of working. The process is very important. I can give you examples whenever. Feminine has special sense of time that we have to understand. Women and tasks move at their own pace. They will move at their own pace. They need their own pace. Seva took 30 years to come to 1 million, and another 10 years to be 2 million. So it's the feminine way and thinking that in our experience in initiating social security to these workers, our sisters, like insurance, pensions, it was not difficult because they think of future more than others. I don't know, but they are ready for future thinking, and that's why they save, they preserve, they hold. So in short, feminine way, that is, it looks at the whole group rather than individuals. In feminine way, she also waits. She has not much problem of waiting for those for catching up. Who are not able to catching up, she does wait, and with grace and kindness and care. So what I would in short say that inclusion in the feminine way, there's more inclusion than domination, integration or segregation, and growing at their own pace. So the values are non-violence, kindness, simpleness, directness, sharing, dignity, self-dignity, and future-oriented. Always think of tomorrow. And they are integrated with culture. Already they are, if they have to wait for somebody, then they will start singing, and they have common songs, and they make up songs. So they are not impatient for the other person to arrive and then abuse him or her. And so the world needs more such feminine leadership wale men. And if I may say, I would say that Gandhi's way, in many ways, is a feminine way.
Yeah, thank you very much, Ela Bhatt, for this thought. Like, you've really philosophically addressed this question. And also, Kaushik, I come to you. I wanted to ask you a question about the focal point approach. But before that, I also want to request you to respond to Ela Bhatt's very insightful kind of projection of the feminine as a figure that can bridge the gaps, because we are also, what I want to ask you later is also about the separation between law and its implementation, the gap between that. So in that context also, this whole projection of Ela Bhatt as feminine, as not really a gender thing, but as a way of living, way of approaching life, way of approaching work, etc. So how do you connect that with, how do you relate to that, and what is your response to that? But I also want to ask you about your own focal point approach in the context of law and economics. We know that laws are ultimately mere words that have no power to really change the way people behave, because Ela Bhatt is talking about a real power to change, a way that can change the way people behave. But laws on paper are mere words. And they cannot change the way people behave or institutions function because of such behavior. what would you say is the real power of law then? I ask this because we also often lament that the culture sector is so uneven because there is no proper cultural policy in India. But can policy or law influence behavior of individuals? Ela Bhatt just talked about how while waiting, women would not would sing and create a certain kind of artistic. They have an artistic approach towards that waiting time. So, can if there is a policy or law, can it influence the behavior of individuals and thereby functioning of institutions or the society at large? Can you explain this vis-a-vis the focal point approach, and can we bring a shift which can impact well-being at this level, which we've just talked about? If so, through which channels of interpretation in the modern world today? What would be the implications of that shift? Over to you, Kaushik.
Thank you. Let me take this in two parts. Just a brief comment first on the feminine, the gender. This is actually fascinating. There were the early studies were in fact from Kerala. Sonaldi Desai, Devaki Jain, couple of other people had done that, giving some money to the household, the same money handed over to the woman rather than to the man, makes a big difference to the well-being of the children. And this was initially just a statistical finding. You hand over the same money in some households to the man, in some households to the woman, and it begins to make a difference, positive difference. Later, we saw more detailed studies from England, where with much more controlled data, from Bangladesh, very interestingly, that not even giving money, calling the women, and this is a bit of a parallel with Seva, once again, what I had seen in that couple of days that I stayed in the Patan district, getting the women out to the village meetings, even if you don't give them money, regularly doing that, them participating in the meeting empowers them. And their empowerment goes into the well-being of the household and the family in a way that you do not get. It's almost a bit of a mystery as to how the empowerment of the woman and the well-being increase takes place. In India, Kerala is a very good example where this has happened. Bangladesh, this has happened. And in the long run, even on traits that we are measuring very mechanically, life expectancy and other qualities, a society begins to do better through this power of the feminine that gets built up through these processes. So I'm acutely aware of that. Let me come now to your other question, which is where I've done some work, which is the focal point approach and law. My interest was provoked exactly by what you were saying, that in the end, the law is nothing but a few things written down on paper. How come that does, when it does change behavior, why does it change behavior? And this I've described as the focal point approach. And in a larger context, I had actually three different influences. One was where you're reminded that in the end, the power of the law, which seems top down, that power is actually in our own hands. It is in ordinary people's opinions and beliefs about one another that the law gets empowered through that. I called my book The Republic of Beliefs, what we believe, ordinary people, the importance of that. And this, my first attention to this was drawn by an activist who was in fact a revolutionary activist fighting authoritarianism in his country, Václav Havel in Czechoslovakia, when he was going into jail, coming out of jail because he was fighting against the authoritarian, totalitarian power of his nation. He writes this pamphlet, the pamphlet which almost became a manifesto of the uprising against totalitarianism, called The Power of the Powerless. It's very much in the spirit of Ela Bhatt's work, The Power of the Powerless, where Havel is pointing out that in the end, the power that seems top down is in our hands. What we do to one another is what empowers the person at the top. And that is the way the power gets built up, through our own attitudes and behaviors to one another. And that little pamphlet, which became the manifesto of the Czechoslovakian uprising, beautifully illustrates this. There's another a period where you see this, the McCarthy period in the United States, starting in 1950. Senator McCarthy, Joseph McCarthy, started bringing accusations against people that they are un-American and plotting to as anti-national, anti-American. So anything you do which is not in the mainstream is treated as anti-national. And this started picking up. And we know in the end, this was happening because someone is charged for being anti-national. You get up and say, no, 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 I know this person is not anti-national. During the McCarthy period, the charge would then turn against you. That, oh, you're defending this person who is being called anti-national, then you are anti-national. And it goes cascading through society. And those 4 years, when there was the rise of McCarthyism in the United States, the American dream could have come to an end because it was a vicious power of every second person top artists. A whole lot of artists, writers were being charged of being anti-national. And this was out of anyone who criticizes the mainstream government is anti-national. That was the McCarthy period. And there's one more writer whom I might quote a little bit, who goes back to the 18th century. David Hume is the philosopher, is puzzling about the power of the authority. And he then points out that in the end, the power is in our own hands. And I'll quote Hume if I can find it here. Yes, I've got it. Nothing appears more surprising to those who consider human affairs with a philosophical eye than the ease with which the many are governed by the few. He's puzzling about that and goes on to say, when we inquire by what means this wonder is affected, we shall find that the governors have nothing more to support them but opinions of ordinary people. It is therefore on opinion only that government is founded. And this maxim extends to the most despotic and most military governments, as well as to the most free and most popular governments. This is David Hume talking about it. And Hume, I should point out, is a great philosopher, also a great human being, a great moral force, and not in any conventional religious sense. He was just a moral force. Hume's writings are beautiful. And what I do in my book is I try to build this up. I have to say that this is, in many ways, it is an academic book. I use bits and pieces of game theory, and I point out that these great ideas which were there in Hume, Hume is writing in 1739, can be given more modern shape using elements of game theory, which are much more recent through the work of John Nash and others. It has come to us using that. And that's how I try to build up and understand how the power of the law and the authority comes. And I do believe that looking at the McCarthy period, how even in a democratic country like United States, everything can get captured by a vitiation of the atmosphere or fear of one another, that danger is ever present. My book is an academic writing, but an academic writing that addresses that danger that is ever present among us, and a danger from which the escape also is in the end in our hands for us to act and get out of that.
Kaushika, this is very important, like, you know, what you're talking about, McCarthyism and the time, all of us know about that, but then this sounds very immediate and urgent, you know, while you speak now, it is as though it's here, and as you said, the danger is ever present, and it is here and now. So, and it is highly inspiring to hear that with such conviction that the power is in our hands and we can change this. The question is, how do we change this? Where do you start, especially in a pluricultural space like this? So I would like to ask this to you, like, before I go to Ela Bhatt with the same question, I want to ask her also the same question, but how do you see this? Like, this is a very almost divided space today, you know, in terms of cultural, you know, we talked about polarization. So how do you access this power of the people to resist this? How, Could you quickly come on this?
Yes, there is no easy answer. And we do know that there are societies which have slid into this kind of control, which have then lasted for 15, 20 years. And it is connected to the economy because invariably the economy crashes after that. You can't get a society like that flourishing. But hope arises from the fact that there are also societies. United States is a good example. After 4 years, and the McCarthy period was dreadful. There were top artists, top writers who were being sacked of all their position and dignity by the masses charging them. There were individuals who played a role. There's no doubt about that. There were important judges in America who stood up and spoke out that this is not the society we are trying to build. There were also voices of ordinary people who were beginning to write. So in the end, again, hope also lies in a similar sense in the voices of ordinary people, people speaking up in their small ways, little ways, making themselves heard. That is how it builds up. At times it takes a very long time. We have seen the fall of colonialism also starts with opinions and ideas and the spreading of ideas. It can take time, but let us hope that this kind of a thing in the United States, the US, the big growth in United States that took place in the 90s, 50s and 60s, the economic growth would have been dashed if the McCarthy period had continued. Fortunately, it did not happen. So once again, the source again is in ideas, opinions, people speaking and writing, and that's all I can say. And there is no 100% guarantee that we will break out of these kinds of things soon.
Thank you, Kaushik. Now, let me bring this same question to 11. 11, we know that there is marginalization and harassment which will happen which is happening in the name of cultures, especially in a country like India. As a lawyer and a social activist, do you see our laws and policies nurturing cultural inclusiveness? We talked about the power of people and individual efforts and in efforts of groups and communities, but do you see our laws and policies nurturing cultural inclusiveness? If they must, what is a crucial change to be brought into the current environment and how do we do this? 11.
First, let me say that you describe me as a lawyer. Ben Rizio, I should answer yes and no. While I joined Textile Labor Union, I was a lawyer. I was put in the legal division as a junior lawyer. And I pleaded some cases for textile workers. And no, because I ceased to be a lawyer when I pleaded for the informal sector workers. And, like Seva members, the court of law did not recognize them as workers. They did not recognize their economic activity as work. And therefore, you see that 89% at that time, 89%, maybe now it is 94% or something. 89% of the workforce in those days, 1955, 56, they were not being recognized as workers. 89% of the workforce of the country, and they were not workers. So there was no law applied to them. And the textile workers who had employer-employee relationship established, and they were protected by law. So then what's the use of pleading for legal rights who are already protected? While here, a large majority being totally unprotected. So I have such experiences. And talking about justice, we go to court for justice. This itself is an injustice. But I would say, go to the extent to say that what we have are the courts of law. They are not court of justice. Uh, uh, so this is what, something has changed, very little now, but however, this has been my experience of my life. Having said that, yes, I'm a lawyer, but millions of my clients have no laws to protect or support them, as I said. So my laws are not in the language of my clients. So right from the beginning, they do not know what applies to them or what protects them. So you call me a social activist. My society fails to protect these millions with basic primary needs. Roti kapda makan, healthcare, financial services, work. So that is the society we have. My society cannot even stand up to protect. Some do, but cannot. They are arrested and put in jail. So the millions of our population who remains poor and therefore vulnerable. So this is the to a social activist, and this is the society we have. You also said that I'm Gandhian. I think everybody is Gandhian. I have not met yet anyone who would not say that truth and non-violence are really very basic values when you talk person to person. So anyway, in such a situation, legal, ideological, social, in such a situation that we shape our culture. I do not exactly know what I'm saying, but shaping the culture. But however, our culture, how can we overlook? How can we overlook this when we are, talking of choices? But anyway, I see more towards, the destruction and a difficult question, what to do or die, that kind of thing.
It is indeed a difficult question, Kaushika. This is also true when you're talking about Ela Bhatt is talking about this unsaid, unmentioned spaces where a law does not come. It is outside of the mentionable space, etc. Culture also has got a lot of such spaces where, if you look at the art space, and I'll bring this conversation closer to the world of arts, you see a lot of spaces where artist spaces which are outside of the mentioned, the generally mentioned sites. So there, what happens, how they live, etc., especially during this time, during the pandemic, this has become an important question. We don't even know. We don't have the data. We don't even know who is where and doing what in the culture sector. So this brings us to this curious relationship between economics and culture, Kaushik. On the one hand, culture considers money as something that must not be brought into its most sacred spaces. There you don't talk about money. it is spiritual, it's beyond the world. But art and culture is also a world where economics play a critical function. In this context, can you envisage the emergence of a nurturing finance and a natural market? These are Ela Bhatt's terms that I am borrowing in the culture sector. Over to you, Kaushik.
Yeah, very happily, just very quickly to touch on what Ela Bhatt was saying, and you also mentioned at the beginning, law and the people's ability to, ordinary people, that's very often, it is not justice, it's just the courts far away. Even in the United States, there are people writing. There is Judge Jed Rakoff, who has written very powerfully that this big machinery, for ordinary people, they don't even know, it's not even available to them, the legal machinery. So it creates exclusion of a kind which is just tragic. I just wanted to emphasize that. Coming, Rizio, to your question about culture and the economy. I do believe actually they are intertwined very deeply. And you can see this almost from historical evidence, though we tend to ignore. I mean, economics is a very walled discipline, and there are disciplines where we work within our own discipline, but you can see examples going back. 400 years BC, Greece flourishing in culture, flourishing as an economy. Italy, 15th century, Britain, 19th century, United States, 20th century. These are flourishing of culture and the arts and also the economy. Is it complete coincidence? I don't think so. I should here mention a bit of a personal thing. There's a young Ugandan music composer who, when I was at the World Bank and I had to work very hard, I got him an internship and got him to the World Bank. And there was a little bit of protestation that what will a person like this to contribute to the World Bank, which is all about the economy and growth. After his period, he's written a book which has just come out called The Creative Wealth of Nations. It's about the arts and culture, and it's intertwining with the economy, which is just so important. The name is Patrick Kabanda is the author of this beautiful book called The Creative Wealth of Nations, the intertwining of the two that gets ignored. And the importance of this, Rizio, again, we can see across the world, in India, that arts have played a role in the sort of flourishing of society. If you see, for instance, during German fascism, there were groups of artists who were coming together to fight against that, and not in the way that normally academics and lawyers or economists would fight up, but in a very different way. I mean, the most prominent name that comes to mind is George Gross, the German artist, and there's a whole lot of them who that time you will remember that in fact the powers that be were scared of artists. And so Emil Nolde, Ludwig Kirchner, Otto Dix, these were all being called degenerate art, and they were being pushed out because of the realization that art actually intertwines with society. And I have to say that even in India, there are movements like that. It's not quite as big, but Sahamat, that was formed as a collective after Safdar Hashmi's assassination, with prominent Indian artists, Atul Dodia, Subodh Gupta, Manjit Bawa, all sort of part of this effort. It is to point out that, you know, these larger values on which society develops. And in the end, our economy also depends on that, which is, I find these groups very attractive to me. One thing is, all the artists I mentioned are artists whose works I love. Clearly, fascism hates the artists whose work I like. But apart from their art, they are making a statement about inclusion, about tolerance in society, which is a Gandhian message being given out. So yes, I'm glad you're bringing up this intertwining of the world of culture and arts and the world of the economy. Because again, in the short run, we can be very narrow-minded and focus on economy for the sake of the economy, wealth for the sake of the wealth. It does not last in the long run. If you actually want a flourishing economy, you need to empower the world of art and culture. And in India, that movement is not big enough. It's there, but we have seen globally in the United States, in Germany during the worst periods, you would have the artists, the musicians, the filmmakers. And this is the creative world coming together to intertwine with the economic world.
Kaushika, thank you very much. We are coming to the close of this first part of this conversation. Before we open it to the audience for their questions, what you say actually bring me to this one word called choice. Like, you know, the movements that you're talking about, or the questions that Ela Bhatt raised. It is also coming to that question of the choices that you make as an individual, as a society, as a nation, as the world at large. So you have deliberated at length on choice theory, and Ela Bhatt has played a major role in enabling women in this country to exercise their choices at various levels. This is a common question again to both of you quickly before I'll pass on this to Mrinalini for the Q&A session. What are the choices that we must necessarily make at the individual, community, and national and global levels in order to evolve this intertwined economy, you know, of nurturance? This is very important. That Ela Bhatt also talked about the lateral kind of thinking, intertwined, lateral, those kind of approaches. How do we, and in this case, how do we balance an individual's choices, which is generally vertical, to that of a community's? And when a community's choices, again, it could be vertical, again, with that of the nation, and a nation's choices with that of the world. So how do we balance this vertical and lateral kind of possibility, choices? Kaushik, I'll go to you first, and then we'll close with Ela Bhatt's response to this.
The connection between these sort of seemingly distant traits, honesty, integrity, trust, with the economy, are actually, once again, if you begin to study, you find that there are proper links. First of all, there were these very broad brush writings like Francis Fukuyama, pointing to societies where there is a lot of trust among people. These are societies which flourish, and these are not hardwired into us. He gives examples of Scandinavian countries, and then later on in East Asia, trust begins to build up and society flourishes. So we know that that matters. For me, again, honesty, integrity, and sort of moral values. And I'm not talking of moral values written in religious texts, but moral values of empathy, kindness, inclusiveness, that we are human beings. That's our first, most important identity. I feel these moral values actually help. And I should also emphasize, even if they did not help economic growth, I would sacrifice a little bit of economic growth for the sake of these values. But let me bring it a little bit closer to the home, and I'll stop. People have been puzzling a little bit about India's own economy. And I feel there is over here exactly the kind of connection, Rizio, that you're hinting at taking place. In India, from 2016, every year, growth has been less than the previous year. It's very unusual. For 5 years, each year's growth less than the previous years has rarely happened. What's happening? Yes, currently it's the pandemic which has caused a big plunge. But before that, for 5 years, we were going down. My feeling is it's this trust and camaraderie in society that is going down. The hate and divisiveness is doing damage. And then how does it do damage? Is it just sort of mystical matter? No. We also know from studies that investment, which is a very economic activity, depends somewhat mysteriously on trust, because everything in life cannot be written down as a law and enforced by lawyers. Trust matters a lot. So when trust begins to break down, investment breaks down. When investment goes lower, and we have statistics that India's investment is falling, when investment goes lower, it begins to affect growth. There are studies. So in the end, these links from trust and these social qualities to growth can be tracked. And I feel what is happening in India, and this is very worrying, that for 5 years, this increase in divisiveness and hate is beginning to hurt the economy. And that is becoming very deep. So all I will say is that let us hope that as a nation, we will wake up to this fact that, and it is not everything for the sake of the economy. The hard power is the weakest of powers. It's soft power, which is more important. And that is what we will nurture. And that is what will give us a more wholesome, more nurturing kind of society and growth. Let's hope that we will get towards that.
Thank you, Kaushik. And I think that is the same message that Ela Bhatt has actually been, in all that she said now. Ela Bhatt, would you like to kind of touch upon this question of choice and the balance of choices that the individual and the community, or if there is a conflict between the individual choice and the community's choice, how do you balance it? Kaushik talked about trust and developing trust as a fundamental value to nurture investments which matter. So how do you look at the question of choice?
I have a concept that I'm following more and more fruitful, and that is thinking the concept of anubandh. So anubandh word comes from the Bhagavad Gita, and anu means to follow, and bandh means relations, bond. So we are all bound together, whether we know it or not. So the concept of anubandh encourages to follow the link of mutual interconnectedness towards a sense of wholeness. So it's an old word, but it has been used. First, it was used by Maulana Azad while he was chairing the education committee called Nayi Talim, also in those days. So, so what it means in practical term is that while making a choice, for example, as a producer, as a trader, as a consumer, we need to think on our own. What the act that I'm going to do, the action, the activity that I'm going to do, and think about its impact. What will be the impact of my doing this? Everything. I drink a glass of water, or I use a particular type of spectacles, or whatever, what I eat, what I dress. So first, think how does my action impact myself? Then how does that action impacts the you, impacts the others, impacts the community? How does my action of drinking a glass of water, how does it impact the nature, the natural resources? And think all of this, think in correlation. So that is anubandh. Think in anubandh. And I think that if we think like this way, so then we will not be far from economy of nurturance as well as cultural well-being. They mean more or less the same, very similar. However paradoxical it may be, however complex, howsoever layered our economy may be, but these choices will help turn the metaphor of culture, of well-being into a reality, and will be reaching the last person in the society, as Gandhi said. He said to us, to reach the last person of the society. So that is possible. Think on our own. But today there is so much bombardment from outside. So it doesn't leave any scope for us to think. So how can, child be taught or made to think on its own?
Thank you very much, Ela Bhatt. That's an absolutely wonderful note on to end this conversation. But I would really like, this is not an end for us at all, because this has opened a lot of questions and thoughts in our own space, and we will certainly take up many of these questions in the days to come. And thank you very much, Ela Bhatt and Kaushik, for this time. I'm handing this over to Mrinalini for the Q&A. I'm sure there are a lot of questions. Mrinalini, over to you.
There is, okay. Yeah, there's already quite a few questions, and some of them are fairly long, so I'm having to, in fact, get to the crux of it. But okay, I'm going to start with a question which has been presented by Sanjeev Kumar. So his question is, he first refers to Adi Shankara. One of the first persons who understood the organic interconnections of different cultures in India was Adi Shankara, yet only a few people know about him. How can we leverage our organic interconnection without people having a functional understanding of such interconnection? This is, in fact, to both Ela Bhatt as well as Kaushik Basu.
Okay, I'm seeing a questionnaire coming up in front of me, but yeah, I'm just...
you can reduce, you can minimize that, in fact. Yeah.
Mrinalini, I wish there was an easy answer and wish I knew how to answer this. There are interconnections, and there is no guarantee that we will discover these interconnections and be able to develop on them. So, and in fact, this is where also the importance of science comes in, that a lot of these seemingly mysterious connections, science is in fact the instrument for investigating these seemingly mysterious interconnections. So what very often would appear mystical, in the end could be scientific. I am a skeptic myself, so I believe that there are just 1,000 things that we will never discover, never know. And even what we know, we have to keep questioning and asking ourselves, do we know what we think we know? But these interconnections, which Sanjeev Kumar is, did I get the name right?
Yes.
Exactly. Yes, I don't have an easy answer, but I believe that that is where science intertwines with some of these earlier spiritual, mystical writings, where you try to bring in evidence, investigation, logic to unearth that. But beyond that, I don't really have an easy answer for this.
Okay. Ela Bhatt, would you like to take that, or I can even move on to another question? Okay.
Yeah, better.
Yeah, okay. So this is a question that's been posed by Shailaja Fennel. She says, feminities and masculinities are affected by economic policy making. There is a global and national data that points to the impact of economic incentives that make women as well as men operate in a selfish manner as opposed to a kind of collective concern. So here you've, kind of emphasized this idea of feminine thinking, of course, not restricted just to women, but across communities, etc. But the fact is that, in fact, even sometimes when there is a sense of, in fact, economic incentive given, there is nurturance that could eventually end up still spiraling into a selfish way of thinking. So how does this work?
I missed out the last bit, it cut off, just literally the last sentence, Mrinalini.
Okay. I'm reading out the question again because it's a bit, so she said, how do feminities and masculinities get affected by economic policy making? There is global and national data that points to the impact of economic incentives that make women as well as men operate in a selfish manner as opposed to a collective concern. So the thing is that at times, even when there may have initially been nurturance or some kind of economic incentive that emerged out of a good space, it could still eventually move into a self-centered view of things. So, and also this aspect of masculine and feminine. So, yeah.
Okay, I can jump into this. Shailaja, I should tell you, is a student of mine. The surname has changed, but yeah, once upon a time, long time ago in Delhi. Very good to have this question. So, femininity, masculinity, that and even otherwise that she's talking about innate traits of ours, how important they are. I have written about assumptions in the woodwork. When we do economics, we write down many assumptions explicitly. People like more goods to less goods, law of diminishing marginal utility. But there are many other assumptions, which are assumptions in the woodwork, which we don't even say, but we take for granted. And selfishness that we talk about. Life is full of unselfishness. And in fact, life would not be possible if those unselfishnesses were not there. They are so hardwired in us that we don't talk about it. It is true, it can vary. There are some societies which can become more selfish and some can become less selfish. And talking of femininity, masculinity, there are cultures, macho culture can be nurtured in a society which in the end can be very destructive. It appears nice and grand, but it can be very destructive. So economics has ignored these assumptions in the woodwork. And we've just assumed that human beings are very linear. They have these traits, X, Y, Z. We write down a couple of assumptions and work with that. But there are these other traits which are important. And this goes back to what earlier we were talking about. Traits like trust, trustworthiness. At one level, it seems a bit mystical. What are these traits? But we do know that we have these kinds of wirings in us. And the wirings are not hard wirings. They are not genetic codes specific to men or women or to a particular race or to a particular religion. These are human traits and they can be developed, they can be destroyed. A lot of it has to do, I'll give you one actually very concrete example. I'm moving away from just gender. You know, punctuality as a behavior trait. We treat the Japanese as very punctual and they indeed are. But there are writings of Europeans in Japan 100 years ago talking about this society which has no sense of time. It has an utterly unpunctual society is Japan being described. Japan has become punctual. These are little traits that begin to change, and some traits are nurturing traits that help growth, and some traits are very destructive traits. And as the feminism, as was being pointed out, there are many qualities of that, and that we are beginning to get data that actually helps the society to flourish and do better. Yeah.
Ela Bhatt, this is a question for you. This is from Divya Shri. So she says that in fact she finds your work as well as that of many others very inspiring. But she says, at what point, say you come from an external perspective with a background in law, and then you work with the community and you empower them. But she says, at what point does external penetration cease? When does the community itself become self-reliant and your role is no longer needed?
Yeah, true. As such, we are not needed and have a particular role. Anyway, at what point? No? She's asking.
Yes, as in you've come from an external role, you've been an important enabler, but the community also has a collective intelligence. And after a point, in fact, the whole idea is to make them self-sufficient. So.
Yeah, that's the best thing. You know, I was born in 1933. So those were the days when the country was fighting for freedom. And the whole atmosphere was of Swaraj, Azadi. And our teachers and our parents, our neighborhood, they all talked about Azadi, and and they, and we were active uh, in some way or the other. So that not any one person, but that is the thing, the atmosphere that was our teacher, our our teacher to grow us up in the society. And then there was also then a vision that was of Purna Swaraj. So until everyone is able to enjoy Swaraj, freedom, uh, our struggle is not complete. So that was the way of life that we were to lead. And Gandhiji had clearly said values. This can be done and this must not be done. So this is must, this is not. So those that way, that was the foundation. But there was not only one person, but the whole atmosphere in the family and all around, school, college. The independence we got also when I was in the second year of the college. So I would say that there was not only one person, but we all had grown up, like that at that time. Is it okay?
Yeah, okay. This is again a question which can be addressed by either of you. This is from Zahira Rahman. She says, some of us who do not have the access to language or the structures of democracy, how should their thinking on their own make a difference? Shouldn't they be made visible first before they can start thinking?
It's not clear if it is if it is being suggested that there are people who are virtually invisible and whose voices need to be heard. Mrinalini, my response to the question is yes, I think that is true, but it is not an easy challenge. In a large society, there are lots of voices, lots of invisible voices. I remember when I was working in the government, there would be people who would occasionally write and say that I've been saying this for so long and no one hears. You sympathize, but you also understand that it is a very busy, cluttered world in which, so it is, I suppose, the question that is being raised over here is that it's a bit of our collective responsibility to try to reach out, to give voice to the voiceless. It does not happen easily. It won't happen easily because there are lots of voiceless voices that are there, muted voices that you need to, and you have to also prevent a cacophony when you allow all these voices to come into place. But I feel it is our individual social responsibility among the people we know, at least to reach out the ones who don't have voice, give them a hearing, and very often you will hear a piece of wisdom which comes as a complete surprise from someone who hardly talks. You go and allow that person to speak and you get a magical idea. So it is our collective responsibility to reach out. And this is again, not something for which there is an easy solution.
Okay. But the experience also says that when you are literate, you go on losing your originality.
Yeah, that's what I think. That's the idea that, yeah.
Stop thinking on your own. Stop having a, dialogue with your own conscience. Education so often limits your capabilities.
And the very idea of people who think differently, in fact, if they are kind of co-opted within the system, on the one hand, it of course empowers you with a certain kind of language to deal with the system, but it takes away often from your ability to then even think outside the system and to change the system. I think that's why she's talking about that kind of a...
and societies, I think, which create space for that, for these voices outside to be heard. society, in the long run, they do well because there are these magical ideas which are there outside. If you are already boxed in and you don't allow those voices to be heard, you can never make use of them. Whereas otherwise, if you allow them to flourish and encourage them to be brought in, then very often you get an idea which is very different from what is being thought inside of the box. And I think in the long run, societies benefit by allowing those voices to be heard.
Okay. Since there's a reference here to education, there's a question from Poile Sengupta and Abhijit Sengupta. And this is with regard to, in fact, education. One is that, of course, he said, addressing you, Kaushik Da, you mentioned the arts as films and the fine arts. What about the written word? Why is literature not included? Why is there no integration of cultural processes and thinking, I'm guessing with economic thinking, at the school level? So start from very early years in terms of the way in which you integrate the two together to think. And similarly, Ela Ben could also share her views on this if, yes.
Yeah, so I actually mentioned art and I did not mention literature only because art seems further away. At least the written word seems a bit closer to what we are doing. And things being done on canvas or music, you seem to feel that there is no connection. So that's the reason why I was stressing that. To Poile Sengupta, again, these are memories coming back from people I've known from earlier. Yeah, okay. It is indeed, actually, literature is very, very important. And once again, some of the best, most powerful ideas come in the form of literature. And you know, literature has an ability which mainstream scientific writing does not have, which is to speak between the sentences. Science is, every sentence is literally taken, that's what we deal with. Whereas there are many messages which can only be conveyed between the sentences, and literature has that ability. You read several sentences and that evokes a thought which is not explicit there. So I do believe that that's actually extremely important. And once again, these are the sort of unwritten wirings in an economy which we give too little space to, but they play a role, and countries that flourish and do well because they create space for these.
In fact, with regard to literature, there's somebody called Srijit Mishra who's also referred to Sultana's Dream by Rokeya Begum in terms of being able to even imagine a society which is run by women and how that actually enables more stability. So it's even offered as an imaginary space where that is possible. I think we are running out of time. So maybe one final question, in fact, which has come. Yeah, okay, so this is from somebody called Sarthak Kathuria. He says, does some sense of homogeneity and still having cultural differences being taken in consideration become an agenda of governing bodies, in the sense that you're basically looking at creating a sense of homogeneity? We are moving towards localization. But do you think that sort of change will be beneficial for India or economies in general?
Sarthak's question, it depends a little bit. You know, when we say that we want to create space for difference, there is also certain common codes which are important for a society to function. And I'll give you a very concrete example. Which side of the road you drive on. If you don't have that minimum norm that everyone drives on the left or everyone drives on the right, then all the other freedoms we will not be able to enjoy. And this is what leads to the notion of the constitution. Some basic rules which are collectively followed. I feel that is important. We can't get away from that. And one of the reasons why I think the world is getting polarized is today, different societies with different norms are coming to occupy the same space. It's almost like if you have an island onto which people come, those who are used to driving on the right and those who are used to driving on the left, they come together on that island. In the beginning, there is going to be conflict. But we have to face up to these. These are difficult challenges. But if we face up to this with just distaste for the other, the case is lost immediately. If we face up to this realizing with empathy that we all come from the same genetic roots, we are all from Africa, barely 80,000 years ago, we spread out of that. If we realize that, then we can look for the common codes and try to underline those common codes much more effectively. So I didn't quite get what the question Sarthak was pinning to us. I've given an answer. In case I've answered a wrong question, it's still an important question that I answered.
Okay. Yes, I think Rizio, there are actually 2 or 3 more questions we want to take, but I realize we're also looking at 8:15 now, so we might have to in fact close the session. So in case there are any closing remarks from Ela, Ben, Kaushik Da, and yeah.
Yes, thank you very much. It's been wonderful. I'll wait to hear Ela Ben, but thank you very much. It's been a pleasure talking.
I have 2 points that left out I wanted to say. May I? Very
yes,
briefly.
yes, please, please.
Yes.
One is about one is about education. I learned that in Latin, education, to educare, means to draw out. So it is not giving something, but rather everybody is with various virtues and values, and they have to be drawn out. So from the child, the teacher draws out whatever good the child has, and then help him to develop. So I think in the education system that exists today, all the more now, which is just pouring, and it is destroying whatever internal, original, real, qualities the child has. So that was the point I wanted to make. I'm losing my faith in the present education system. The other is about we were talking about art. So talking about art, the too close to culture, almost one art is used as culture and culture is used as art. And we have done so all the time. It bothers me. We are increasing the distance between art and law, art and society, art and economics. So why? Maybe we have stopped seeing art as work or work as art. Work is artful. So how to bring, my question is that how to bring art closer to economy. Of course, not as an item to buy, to purchase, to invest in, but by as a way of cultural, social, and cultural well-being. That is what I have been always. The other thing that worries me is that is the distance between art and artist. So our focus and my focus always remains on people. So how can we change this sequence? We forget the artist, then it's more. So why not invest more in artisans, craftsmen, then women and their daughters, and let us see what comes out. So let there be. Everybody has the art. The best is art of living, Jivan Kala. So, but how can everybody's potential of art aesthetics can come out? So that is a question in my mind. And lastly, I want to underline that when we are talking of of 89%. So I want to remind everybody, we must not forget that all amongst our workforce, the largest number is what we call them as Dalits, as women, as minorities, Adivasis. They are all part of our workforce. Majority of them are part of the workforce, and then why? At that time, why do we forget that those are the main pillars of our economy, our world of work? But often they are being forgotten, or rather not mentioned. So I would like to underline that. That's all.
Thank you very much, Ela Bhatt and Kaushik. I would like to conclude by saying that this the new path that we are taking at Mars is actually an attempt to use Ela Bhatt's term to think in Anubandh, to kind of move away from that vertical specialization where you think that art is one vertical and which is different from economics or which is different from science. Or, we are really trying to create that marg where we can all come together and interact. So the marg as a metaphor where for a space where interactions are possible, hierarchies are not there, and you're interacting. As Ela Bhatt rightly said, we are all coming from different spaces with different virtues, and the exchange is what matters. So, and how can you collectively create a reality which is where everyone is nurtured, everyone's aspirations are nurtured, artistic potential is nurtured. So this is the kind of paths that we are also exploring at this point as an organization. So that is this very conversation is kind of showing that this is the path that we are on at this point. So I am so thankful to the two of you for this great insights which have come during this span of like around 1.5 hours. This is there are a lot of things that we would like to take up later in various forms, and I wish to continue this conversation in various other ways also. Thank you very much, and I'm sure the audience also must have really enjoyed this conversation, and thankful to all of them. And Nalini, would you like to close? Thank you very much, Kaushik and Ela Bhatt, and Nalini, let's close.
Yeah. Thank you, of course, to both the speakers. And as Rizio mentioned, the idea with both the Marg Salon series as well as with the magazine is to bring a lot of other fields in conversation with art, whether so this session has been on economics and governance. We've had astrophysicists, we've had people, in fact, from urban planning, lots of different fields coming together, and we hope to continue with the series. But of course, today's session, I think we'll have to bring to a close. Unfortunately, there were a few other questions I couldn't take up, and hopefully the people will post them again. We might be able to share them also with Kaushik so that you can individually respond to them. For more updates on Marg's publications and events, please log on to www.marg-art.org and also follow our social media handles on Instagram and Facebook. Among the many new things that we now have, besides, of course, the revamped magazine, is also a Marg blog, where you can both read as well as contribute to short takes on cultural matters, as well as reviews. And then there's also a special artist corner, so please look that up. And of course, there's going to be our December magazine, as well as an upcoming book, which is on the history of paper currency in India. You might both be very interested in this. It's looking at the changing nature of iconography, as well as what money played, the roles that money played. So that's by Basil Sheikh, who was with the Reserve Bank of India. And of course, there are many other events and publications that we also have under our wing. So do subscribe to the Mark Foundation, and please, gift digital as well as print copies. Digital copies are now available even for the books. So yes, look forward to all your support and more interactions. Good night for now. And good morning, actually, to Kaushik. So,
yeah.
yes.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Good night and good morning.
Yeah, lovely it was. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Great, great.